Muted.
January members call. A few housekeeping details for today's webinar. Please note that we'll be muting all participants other than the speakers, just in order to limit the ambient noise and feedback during the call. However, we still really do hope for participation from the audience, so you're welcome to use the chat box and chat function in the GoToMeeting app to share questions either with the
Muted.
or just to me individually. And I'll be sure to pass it along to Chris on your behalf. We are also recording today's webinar. Our goal at NCC is to ensure that you are aware of high-impact issues and that we provide you with information regarding the avenues you may take on issues that affect your community. Chris Mitchell, the Next Century Cities Policy Director and Director of the Community Broadband Networks for the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, is our moderator today, and I will hand off to him to introduce our participants and to start the conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brendan. This is Chris, and I believe we have Deb on the line. She's on a sort of listen-only mode because of the nature of her connection. It's difficult for her to have a high-quality speaking role in this hour. So thank you, Brendan, for introducing. And in case anyone's curious, I'm sure Deb is listening in. We're going to do the introductions. We're going to keep it light. We're going to keep it quick. We are going to have a lot of really good material. And you should feel free to ask questions throughout. Brendan, I'll ask you to just interrupt me or to send me a note here on the screen when you have some questions if I don't see them. But we will be trying to move through a variety of topics by having shorter comments and lots of them from our panel rather than longer comments. We're going to start off by, I'm going to have a brief, I'm just actually going to say the person's name and title basically and ask them a brief question for this introductory round. And then we're going to move on to more of a discussion round where people can jump in and I won't have to necessarily recognize them. So I'm going to start with Ellen Satterwhite of the Glen Echo Group. Can you please give us the scoop on who you are, both I think you a little bit of background, the Glen Echo Group, and why Wi-Fi Forward as a coalition is important?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for tuning today. I'm Ellen Satterwhite with the Glen Echo Group. We're a strategic communications firm based. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You're dropping some frames, it sounds like.
Is this better?
Yes, that is better.
Great. We'll try this. So, sorry. Thanks again, Chris. I'm with the Glen Echo Group. We're a strategic communications firm in Washington, D.C. I usually tell people we're an advocacy firm or hire. We work on a lot of tech issues, disruptive issues.
Sorry to get.
Is it
it's
bad?
A little bit better. Whenever you start speaking a little bit more rapidly, it's getting a little garbled, and I hope that's not only me, and I'm interrupting for no reason. But would you be able to connect again and see if you get a better connection?
Let me do that. Why don't you move on, and I'll connect again.
Okay. All right,
Great.
We'll come back to Ellen, and we're going to move on to Harold. Harold Feld, a Senior VP, Vice President, Public Knowledge. And I think many of our audience have already heard you on previous calls, so maybe you could just very briefly remind us what Public Knowledge does. But I think you would be really well poised to give us a big picture on what unlicensed spectrum is, which is what Wi-Fi uses, and why it matters for our future.
Okay, so Public Knowledge is a nonprofit digital advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. We are devoted to providing, trying to make sure that there is broad and access to affordable access to broadband, as well as a freedom to innovate and create with new technologies. So unlicensed spectrum is an invention of the United States going back to the mid-1980s, where we said, you know what, normally we require that people get a specific permission called a license from the FCC in order to do stuff. We are going to say there are certain uses that don't need that. In fact, any use that can operate at a low enough power level that it won't interfere with the license stuff and is willing to take interference from everybody else go ahead and use that stuff without worrying about getting permission from anybody else about when and how you can use it. So that is what we call unlicensed spectrum, because it is not licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. Some people now refer to it as open spectrum, or shared spectrum, or license-exempt spectrum, but at its heart, it's really just a way to access the electromagnetic wireless capacity that in a way that is open, that is flexible, and free for those who are willing to put up with whatever level of interference happens to be around at the time.
And I think we would say, to sort of hammer that home, it's not only free in terms of your pocketbook, you don't need permission, even if you would have had to pay. Sometimes just the getting of permission could be a problem. So there's two components on that. Right,
and this one has the great virtue of being free both as in beer and as in speech.
Right.
So it's become a very, and because you don't have to pay potentially billions of dollars for licenses, and you don't need permission from the FCC or some licensee. It's become a very innovative space and a very affordable way for people to to do things that require basic connectivity, which would otherwise be just very expensive to provide.
Great, and I see that Ellen's back, but I want to just introduce Paul, and then we'll give Ellen her chance to do the introductory round. Paul Garnett, you're with Microsoft, and most of us think of Microsoft as a software company. I'm sorry, if you don't mind telling me your title again. In this version of notes I have before me, I did not include it. Oh, it's there. Okay. I just have to read further. Most of us think of Microsoft as a software company. You're the director of Affordable Access Initiatives, and so I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what that means and why the Wi-Fi Forward Coalition is important for Microsoft.
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Paul Garnett from Microsoft. The Microsoft is basically, along with the industry in which we operate, sort of undergone a transition over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, where we once sold all of our software in boxes, and now we're a cloud-based services provider. What that has meant is that we're all the more reliant on connectivity and access in order to deliver our services to customers. We've been hugely successful as a company, as everyone knows. We're a global brand, and there are roughly about 2 billion people in the world who, in one way or the other, use our technology. But what that means is that there are about 5 billion people in the world or more that actually have never had access to our technology, haven't used it. And if you look at access itself globally, you have about 3.2 billion people in the world who are online, meaning about 4.2 billion people are not. So from a Microsoft perspective, as we look forward, it's critically important that we are able to deliver our services to our existing customers in a way that's affordable for them and is on connections that are of high quality, and those connections are ubiquitous, meaning that people can access the applications and services they want whenever they want them, wherever they want them. But also we want to figure out ways to expand our market footprint so that more people can get online. So I spend a lot of time in emerging markets where there are a lot of people who are not online. But of course that's a problem in the U.S. as well, where we still haven't been able to address issues like universal access. When we look at something like unlicensed wireless technology or technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and Zigbee and other types of technologies that use unlicensed frequencies, the simple fact is that for a company like Microsoft, most of the connections, indeed the connection I'm on right now, is over unlicensed frequency. So most of the time when someone is using our software and applications and services, they're going to be on an unlicensed connection. So So we want to make sure that when it comes to policy making in the space, of course, there should be license frequencies for things like LTE, but there also needs to be a nice balance of unlicensed frequencies as well across a range of bands, so that unlicensed access can continue to thrive. One other thing just to highlight on top of what Harold just said, another reason why we think unlicensed is a critically important mode of access is because it really is the ultimate low barriers to entry type of a model. And I've had the benefit at Microsoft to work with a lot of entrepreneurs around the world who are looking to get into the broadband space and want to provide all kinds of cool different services to different types of customers. And the best way for them to enter the marketplace is through use of unlicensed frequencies. And when they get big and powerful, they'll go and buy licensed licenses. But in order for them to get started, there's nothing better than having access to unlicensed frequencies to provide the first generation of services to their customers.
Excellent, thank you. And not to get too geeky on it, but for people who weren't aware, Microsoft has a history of doing things that I think are very helpful in this regard. Microsoft, as this story, as I understand it, was essential in terms of introducing consumer devices that allowed people to buy one internet connection from their ISP and then to connect a number of devices in the home, and the ISP was not able to track basically what was happening inside the home. And originally they had an idea the ISPs were going to sell us each a connection for every single device. So this is not anything new for Microsoft. You've sort of been wading into this for a while.
Right.
Ellen, I hope we're able to connect with you better now. Can you tell us more about the Glen Echo Group and why the Wi-Fi Forward campaign is important to you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Wow, you sound excellent.
Much better, good, good. Thank you, Chris, thank you, Michael and Harold, or excuse me, Paul and Harold. Now I don't have much to say, just kidding. Wi-Fi Forward is a coalition of technology companies like Microsoft, like Broadcom, Google, Ruckus Networks, you may have heard of before, communications providers, cable companies, wireless internet service providers, and public interest groups and public sector institutions like the American Library Association or Public Knowledge, Harold's group. So we are a big, broad organization, and our mission is to raise awareness about the value of technologies that use the unlicensed spectrum bands, including Wi-Fi, Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, RFID, sensors, etc. We kind of grew out of this idea that while unlicensed spectrum is free in both senses of the word, as Harold points out, that's almost one of its downfalls. There isn't a Wi-Fi lobby in Washington, D.C. because we all benefit from it, but who's going to sort of take up the mantle for it? Well, it turns out a lot of these groups will. So I have the pleasure of working with all of these organizations and private things. So one thing that we've done, we've produced a number of studies quantifying the impact of spectrum on the U.S. economy. We've looked at projecting its future value. We've looked at how Wi-Fi in particular is an important on-ramp for internet use for traditionally underserved populations. And we've looked at unlicensed spectrum in education. But why do we exist? It's because as technology like Wi-Fi becomes more popular, it strains the bounds of the spectrum we have available. So a couple of statistics. Cisco predicts that by 2017, just Wi-Fi devices will power a majority of all internet traffic. So this growth means that Wi-Fi itself is a huge success story, that unlicensed spectrum produces these massive success stories, but it also might mean that getting on the internet through a Wi-Fi connection might be soon like trying to drive a car in rush hour traffic on too narrow a road, frustrating and slow moving. So we see a lot of hope here in DC, because that's federal spectrum policy is done at the federal level. Congress and the FCC are working to free up more spectrum in various ways, and maybe later in the conversation I'll tell you about some opportunities we see to urge them forward and opportunities to get involved. But we also, as an organization and as a group of companies and people and institutions, believe it's important that everyone who uses the existing Wi-Fi ecosystem do so in as responsible and cooperative a manner as possible. That's what has sort of led to what used to be junk bans from this spectrum that wasn't valuable, wasn't useful in anyone's mind, to useful enough to be auctioned off. It is what has led to this enormously successful ecosystem we have today. So just as traffic can flow smoothly and reliably on the highways at various high rates of speed, but grind to a halt if a selfish or irresponsible driver gums up the works, the same is true for Wi-Fi. And so one issue in particular that you may have read about in the news is a new cell phone technology that
Ellen,
shares. Yeah.
Sorry, you mind if we just save that for a second and we'll come back to that
I would
in
love
a minute?
to. Sure.
Excellent. I want to we'll talk specifically about that threat to Wi-Fi, but I wanted to just as well give a step back to note that for people who might not be as technical, there's some confusion sometimes in terms of what Wi-Fi is, and reporters will often write about Wi-Fi from the cable company or something like that, and I think it's important to note that broadband is sort of like a fast internet connection, effectively. That Wi-Fi is one form of wireless, the most popular form of wireless to move stuff, but there are other forms of wireless too, and Harold, we can start with you on this because you had already compiled a bit of a list, but tell us what sort of things cities are using Wi-Fi for right now and why they need to be concerned, because they may not be aware of all the ways in which they're dependent on Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just if we're just talking about Wi-Fi, as opposed to all of the other applications up on license, some of which are used for connectivity, some of which are used for tracking things. But first of all, we have cities have a large number of open access hotspots at this point. I can't. I'm not just talking about libraries and other traditional places, but for both business and for the public, everybody, if they are coming to a city council meeting, expects to have Wi-Fi access and be able to do things like live tweet and otherwise report on the meeting. The city, we have meter readers, we have parking. Parking meters that are now connected to each other wirelessly. We have an increasing amount of public safety features, some of which are things to do with next generation Wi-Fi that have to do with more sophisticated location information, so that as people may know, we have a lot of problems with finding people inside an apartment building, but there is the future of the Internet of Things, which now means, if one will excuse me, an awful lot of things. Devices talking to each other, keeping track of inventory, all of these are things that usually report back through some kind of Wi-Fi. I mean, everybody's printers and peripherals are dependent on this. We have competition that is now emerging, which is very important for localities through what are called Wi-Fi first strategies. So you have people who are looking for more affordable mobile service. They may be getting it from a cable company or a company like Republic Wireless, which relies on Wi-Fi first, and then if it can't find an open Wi-Fi spot, try to use some kind of leased license spectrum as a backup.
Great.
Then and I could go on and on. It is every convention center now has to have it, and these are no longer things that are considered luxuries. And I'll also add one last, which is just the use of wireless ISPs, WISPs, to provide affordable service or extensions of libraries and other things to try to offset the digital divide. And these things, as I was saying, are no longer considered luxuries or something cool to attract business or tourists. These are now things that most people consider to be necessities in a well-functioning city, and that's a lot of things.
Right. It's actually surprising to the extent to which schools, public safety, if you just took Wi-Fi away tomorrow, the disruptions would be incredible. Fortunately, no one's talking about taking it away tomorrow. Paul, I'm wondering if you can help provide some context, because the impression I get is one of we're trying to cram all this stuff into the more and more stuff into the same area of spectrum. Is that the primary threat to the future of Wi-Fi?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play, and actually just to add to Harold's list, let's not forget various different IoT applications for things like environmental monitoring and water safety and air quality and all that kind of stuff. So we've seen that Wi-Fi being used in all kinds of ways.
And I'll just say for people, IoT is the abbreviation for Internet of Things, if you've not come across that yet.
Yeah, or I mean the other sort of buzzword is sort of smart city applications. They're basically I always feel like there are two conversations going on around spectrum issues and spectrum policy. One is this massive growth of data that you talked about earlier, and it's all measured in billions and trillions. It's not. This is in terms of the growth and growth of devices, and also just the growth of traffic over frequency. So, and this whole area of Internet of Things or smart city is driving a lot of that now. So it's not just a matter of devices that we use, like cell phones and laptops, but it's devices that are working on our behalf as citizens in the city or a town. And so that's placing a lot of pressure on our existing frequencies, and that's part of the reason why, for example, there's such interest in getting access to more of the 5 gigahertz frequencies that are used for really high, great high capacity, short range Wi-Fi applications. At the same time, there's this second set of issues that in the spectrum policy space around universal access and the need to get more people in the world connected in the first place. One of our biggest problems isn't so much that the people at the top don't have enough. It's that the people at the bottom are so far behind those at the top, and we've got to figure out ways to, while a kid in Seoul, South Korea is getting 1 gigabit per second broadband connectivity, we need to make sure that a kid in rural Kenya gets his first megabit per second of broadband connectivity, and that kid in Kenya is not left behind. So we've got to figure out ways to use wireless technologies to affordably deliver access to everyone. And so we're involved, for example, in promotion of a technology called TV white spaces. Basically, the idea of allowing unlicensed access to some of the frequencies that are below roughly 700 megahertz, the old UHF band frequencies, and eventually VHF as well. And what's great about that technology is it's not so much that it's good for super high capacity short range links like you're going to get at 5 gigahertz and above, but rather it's really good for long range communications. So you can use that like a small wireless ISP could, or a city or a town or a public safety authority could go out and build a network that covers very large geographic area using these frequencies along with some other frequencies. And we're doing that with a whole bunch of partners around the world right now, and we're just starting to do it in the U.S. as well.
Right. I think one of the senses we get is that there's tremendous potential, and it's actually somewhat ironic. Well, maybe it's not ironic. It's predictable that Wi-Fi has been so successful at getting every last bit of value out of it that it's just getting very crowded. And so we're finding ways of sharing other aspects of the spectrum where it may not be used as efficiently, such as in the TV white spaces. Ellen, I'd like to come back to you with the point that you were just heading into, which I think is a different kind of threat. I mean, this other kind of threat was sort of this organic growth of things, but I would say what you're about to talk about in terms of some of the cell phone companies trying to smush their traffic down into here as a sort of in some ways, a nefarious threat rather than an organic one.
Yeah, no, you know, we hesitate to talk about it that way because I think cell carriers are trying just as they're trying to make the most out of their networks and are also trying to deal with the explosion of data and traffic that they'll be seeing over their networks. And so one of the technologies being discussed is a technology called LTE unlicensed, or LTEU, which ties together licensed and unlicensed frequencies using the LTE protocol that we're mostly familiar with from our cell phones. Except unlike offload, which is what cell carriers do already, where they move traffic from their networks off to Wi-Fi because it helps it move faster, and unlike offload, that uses the standard Wi-Fi protocol, this is a new approach that will introduce new forms of signaling into the unlicensed spectrum bands that a number of engineers, a number of companies, a number of advocates are concerned, and testing has shown, as currently conceived, will interfere with Wi-Fi, which I think, Chris, is why you call it nefarious. So but the analogy that I was making is, you know, traffic flows smoothly and reliably on the highways at very high rates, and that's how your Wi-Fi traffic is moving on unlicensed spectrum. But if a selfish or irresponsible driver sort of makes a turn the way that they want to make a turn, it can stop the whole flow of traffic. So LTEU, the example I use, kind of runs the risk of crowding out existing Wi-Fi applications or clogging up those lanes by refusing to cooperate or talking over almost other Wi-Fi users.
But I think you might say, you know, if this was a nefarious plan, that's sort of the worst case scenario. But even in a good case scenario, this has the potential to just, you know, cause interference in an area where we can barely afford it.
Right, and so the worry is that this technology is introduced, you know, tomorrow into an area that's crowded already, and tomorrow is hyperbole, but in the very, very near future, into an area that sees a lot of Wi-Fi traffic already, and then you or I, as a Wi-Fi consumer, or you know, a city service, or in a classroom, would immediately see Wi-Fi begin to degrade. This is what we believe based on the tests that we've seen. You'd immediately believe, or you'd see the Wi-Fi degrade, and you wouldn't have any recourse. You wouldn't know what to do. You can't call your cable company or your broadband provider or your you know, DSL company. It's not their problem at that point. You've really you don't have a recourse. So one thing that we are trying to do is let people know about the potentials for this technology. And you know, many experts do believe some type of this technology and Wi-Fi and other unlicensed uses can coexist, but only if stakeholders get together and establish the right rules of the roads and standards for sharing the spectrum.
And so I think if I understand correctly, the Wi-Fi Forward Coalition stands to do multiple things, but one of the most pressing ones right now is making sure that this technology doesn't interfere with this ecosystem that's already working so well.
Yeah, I think and the way we're trying to do that is by advocating for this collaborative process and advocating for a standard-setting process that has worked very well even in the last 20-plus evolutions of Wi-Fi. You know, we're on, when we talk about second-generation cell phone technology, third generation, fourth generation, moving into fifth generation, we're on almost, I'm going to get this probably wrong, but 22G of Wi-Fi. And that's because there has been this collaborative international standard-setting process that's gotten us to this point. So we're really advocating for all stakeholders, all companies with an interest in this to move towards a process like that.
Well, I want to make sure that caller or that that everyone who's on the call knows they can ask questions. We haven't had any submitted yet, to my knowledge. But this is the sort of thing that we think Next Century Cities, you know, as an organization, will be supporting Wi-Fi Forward and trying to make it easy for you to take action as things come up. So we do have one excellent question that just came in, which is there a good spectrum map that helps visualize the challenge that Ellen is talking about in terms of well, the spectrum that's threatened?
I wish. Unfortunately, this is an area where there is a crying need, some of which has to do with the complexity of putting it together such a map, because things change constantly. But the other is that if you look at the official government map of you know, how spectrum is allocated to which services, and you know, it looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. It's very hard for people to see and understand, and part of this is that engineers are not very good and coming up with ways that normal people visualize things, and the rest of us are not really good at understanding enough of what the engineers are telling us. So putting together such a map is actually hard, and it needs fairly constant update, which means that nobody's really done a good job of it yet.
There is, if you do a search for spectrum map, there is one that will pop up in general that will tell you how all the spectrum is allocated, and then the FCC does have a spectrum dashboard, which you could peer into. But one of the things, and I'm curious, you know, Paul, Ellen, Harold, if anyone wants to jump in, one of the senses I get is that one of the things Wi-Fi Forward needs to do is to advocate for more spectrum being dedicated to this unlicensed policy, because I would risk saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the gains from unlicensed spectrum appear to dwarf that of licensed spectrum at this point.
Well, so I will jump in. Oh, sorry, Paul.
Go ahead, Ellen. I'll do the jumping in.
Okay. Well, all I was
We're
going
going to use
say.
our politeness protocols and allow each other to speak first. And then I will cede the floor to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. All I was going to say is, so a couple of additional statistics. One of our studies has found, and this is actually a conservative estimate when compared with similar studies, but that these technologies, that is technologies running over unlicensed spectrum, generate $222 billion in economic value for the United States each year, or that was for 2014. And by 2017, researchers expect these technologies to generate $547.2 billion and contribute about $50 billion directly to the U.S. economy. So These are massive numbers, but I will also I'll let Paul jump in because I don't know. We don't want to say licensed is or unlicensed is better than licensed. They're so complementary, and one increases the value of the other.
Well, before Paul jumps in, let me just suggest that for people who aren't aware, we're talking about that incredible gain from unlicensed spectrum. Imagine what would happen if we had spectrum that wasn't interfered with by microwave ovens and the like. I mean, so I just want to make sure that that's the sense. I don't mean to suggest we don't need license, but I just want to give a sense of what we are dealing with.
Sure.
Right, and I just want to emphasize something a little. It's not just that we would be able to get more and more devices on to do this particular stuff, because and I'll point out when we were worried about that with licensed spectrum, we called it a spectrum crisis. We passed this law that will allow these very complicated auctions where broadcasters are going to sell, because oh my God, iPhones were making it so hard for the people with the licensed stuff who already have the vast bulk of spectrum that is available for mobile or fixed broadband use. But even 5 years ago, they were getting so filled up by all of this stuff that we had to basically turn things inside out to try to find them some more. Whereas Wi-Fi, which is supporting much more of the actual data transfer, much more of the use, and has many, many more devices that are being added on a regular basis, is expected to make do with the same allocation of scraps that we had in 1989 and 1997.
That's terrific. We have a great question that's come in, and I want to give Paul a chance to do that, jumping in before we get to it.
Yeah, I was just going to just a couple quick comments. One, yeah, certainly there needs to be more dedicated allocations for unlicensed access, but the reality is that it's not easy to move people. When you're trying to evict someone, it's not something that happens all that fast. So for new licensed bands, I think I'm getting a little bit. Not sure why.
Sorry, Paul, you were starting to echo just a little bit at the end. I'm going to read the question. And Ellen, the echo seems to be coming through you.
Oh, dear.
So if you don't mind muting yourself when you're not speaking, and then I'll make sure you don't get ignored. The question is a terrific question in terms of asking us to separate out where we're asking for regulation, I suspect from the FCC, and where we're looking for industry cooperation to solve these problems.
All right, well, this is Harold. Let me just start out by saying there is no such thing as spectrum that the FCC does not regulate, whether licensed or unlicensed, because somebody's got to bless the standards. When we're talking about what level of activity is safe, meaning won't interfere with other people's transmissions, or that we can assume if there is some kind of interference that it is handleable, that requires the FCC to bless these things, because people have to know what power limit can I use, what's the expectation. So the FCC is always going to be involved. Now, when we talk about, though, on kind of the practical matters, yeah, but are we talking about, a really sort of massive rulemaking? I'd say the pattern is some of both. The FCC generally prefers if you can get the various industry sectors to go along, if you can do things through voluntary industry standards. That makes life much, much easier for the FCC because they're under-resourced. They don't like having to make these decisions. But the reality is that there are a lot of very different interests out there. And as Paul was alluding to, we have a phenomenon that occurs that if people have a license and they're using it in a particular way, a lot of times their reaction to anything new in the neighborhood is, well, I can't see how that's going to help me, and it might hurt me, so I will fight it tooth and nail. So that makes voluntary cooperation very difficult. On the other hand, the economics of the industry are changing. Even the carriers that rely heavily on licensed spectrum, the Verizon, T-Mobiles, and so on of the world, are recognizing that licensed spectrum is just not efficient enough and they can't do it alone. So there is now much more interest across the industry in trying to get cooperation and working together. But frankly, even there, you have the problem that even where people have an interest in cooperating with each other, they also have an interest in advantaging each other. And for a lot of this stuff to get done, you frankly have to have the FCC in the role of dealing with holdouts, because if it's going to be an industry voluntary thing, one company like Qualcomm holding out can prevent anything from happening unless the FCC comes in and says, no, this is the way it's going to happen. So it's really a mix and a cooperative process. And I would, particularly in the spectrum area, the FCC plays much more of a role of facilitator, trying to get the parties to come in and agree with each other, rather than what people tend to think of as regulation, where you impose a whole new set of burdens on one set of actors for a public policy reason.
And Ellen, I believe you what you were talking about in terms of the threat to LTE. Now I'm getting a little echo from Harold, although I think that's just ended now. I think you were talking more, Ellen, about industry cooperation in terms of all the different generations of Wi-Fi we've seen, the 802.11 specs, and is that right?
That's right, Chris. And sort of the industry, the cooperation, not just in, I say industry, but we sometimes mean individual engineers. We sometimes mean folks experimenting, taking advantage of the low barriers to entry, and coming up with a new standard or protocol or use or device. And the sort of cooperation we've seen in the unlicensed spectrum is incredible.
Thank you. Paul, I'm really curious in terms of your focus on really trying to make sure that we're able to bring everyone online. What is the role in terms of additional unlicensed spectrum to make that happen?
Yeah, just to complete the thought earlier, yeah, definitely we need more allocations of unlicensed, and I think all of us have been pushing, for example, for more than 5 gigahertz. And then also...
I'm sorry, can you just specify for people a little bit of background on why you use 5 gigahertz as an example?
Well, because this is the kind of the growth band for Wi-Fi right now. So as Harold mentioned earlier, for a long time, Wi-Fi was basically limited to a finite amount of frequency in the 2.4 gigahertz band. But the Wi-Fi community has been eyeing 5 gigahertz as a band that is lightly used and has a lot of frequency that's potentially available for unlicensed access. And the FCC and other regulators around the world have been increasing the amount of the 5 gigahertz frequency that's available for Wi-Fi, and you have these new standards for Wi-Fi like 802.11 AC, which take advantage of the fact that you can combine a whole bunch of slivers of spectrum to create really big wideband connections over Wi-Fi. So you're able to sync that movie in just a matter of seconds from one device to another in the living room, for example, as a use case. So so that's why I keep referencing that, and there's a lot of debate right now as to which portions of that should be made available and under what conditions. The other reason why 5 gigahertz is a good example to talk about is because this is a band in which there are incumbent users and they're not going anywhere. So increasingly we're seeing models where it's not as if you're clearing an entire band to make it available for Wi-Fi. In fact, what you're doing is creating situations in which Wi-Fi can actually share access to that frequency on a secondary basis with other incumbent users already in there. and that's going to become the norm in the future because it's getting harder and harder to move people. And this is going to happen across licensed and unlicensed kind of models. So even the big mobile operators are looking to this model of sharing as a way for them to gain access to frequency, even if it's licensed. And we saw that recently with one of the big auctions that happened in the U.S. at 1.7 gigahertz to continue being geeky. So yeah, so we're going to see more of this kind of sharing, and of course, as people use devices more, we're going to need to find more of these frequencies, and more often than not, it's going to be on a shared basis, not as a result of a clean reallocation of frequency to unlicensed access and Wi-Fi.
When we were talking about what we need to change in the call prep, Harold, you had suggested one of the things we need is support from local initiatives and local businesses. Tell us more about why that's important.
As well, first of all, I would say one of the great things about open spectrum Wi-Fi and its other applications is that it really allows small businesses to get in on the game. To get in on the game in terms of providing value-added services, to get in on the game in terms of providing broadband access, and I just think local governments in particular ought to be supporting these kinds of local initiatives. They encourage competition. They provide local jobs. They, often because they are, relying on these off-the-shelf technologies rather than, very expensive carrier equipment, they can provide services either cheaper or more competitively.
And how would one support these changes?
Well, for example, in most places you will find smaller businesses that are offering connectivity services for IoT and for metering and other through local vendors, because they can offer these things through as I say, they can offer these things locally through local equipment. You have wireless ISPs that serve in major urban areas. Most people tend to think of them as being primarily for rural localities, but in fact there are there are major cities, New York City, Boston, Washington, which I happen to know just because I live and have connections to those, that have commercial wireless ISPs available. They don't necessarily provide residential service, but these are things that places where local governments can hire them for their local projects, as opposed to going with the national carriers, or at least ought to consider a preference for local businesses in the same way that they do for other lines of service.
So if I would understand correctly, basically, then because those companies would have more support, they would have more ability to succeed in the marketplace. Their message would be heard in Washington, and there'd be. Is that the dynamic that you're looking for?
Yes, that's an important dynamic. First of all, it validates these companies as real and genuine providers, not just providers of last resort. It makes them increasingly viable and allows them to showcase their ability and services for other local business. It generally grows the sector and demonstrates the importance of the sector and raises visibility. And it also just basically provides competition, which helps drive down broadband prices generally. So for all of the things, I certainly urge folks to support local businesses, and also to support local initiatives that are offered on a voluntary basis. There's a project called Wireless Harlem, for example, in Washington, in New York City, which is focused on providing service, low cost and free service in Harlem in association with local public schools and in local buildings. That's a thing that local governments can actively encourage. Local governments can look at the assets they have in the ground now, whether it is fiber that they have for other purposes, whether it is a budget designed to do things like foster connectivity, and can say, we really ought to look at whether there is a way to leverage, the assets that we have now, whether they are, things like lampposts or things like fiber, whatever, and see if we can partner with one of the wireless ISPs to offer low-cost connectivity. New York City's current project is one obvious example where they have they are transforming all of the remaining payphones, which are not being used as phones, into Wi-Fi, into public Wi-Fi hotspots and charging stations.
Well, I think it's an excellent example, and I know that between you and I we could go on with many more. But I think that point's been made. We have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to move on to another point, which is Ellen. Can you tell us who is there like an anti Wi-Fi for? Is there a Wi-Fi backward lobbying group? Like who's opposing our list of solutions?
No, there's just a couple of, so Paul mentioned earlier, it's difficult to move people, right? It's difficult to move incumbent users from the band. So to the extent that some of these bands have been that we're looking to expand unlicensed uses into or to share with unlicensed technologies, have incumbent users, and for various reasons, that discussion is a hard discussion, right? So I would say they are less supportive of at least maybe, or want to slow down moving forward. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, a number of, or a few cell companies and technology companies like Qualcomm who are interested in exploring LTE-U and have had shown little concern for some of the coexistence issues, at least early on. So, it's not contentious, or excuse me, it's not bloody, but it certainly is contentious, and especially when you're talking about spectrum policy and sharing spectrum and moving people around to make the most efficient use of the spectrum.
And final technical question as we're wrapping up. The question is, if LTE-U is using LBT in Europe, what is the technical reason that they are not doing that here in the U.S.? And I hope I haven't mangled that question. The acronyms get a little bit beyond.
Because they can get away with not using it in the U.S. The regulations will not require it. So that's the basic answer. Basically, the regulators in Europe look to standardization, and standardization will require it once everyone gets together. Whereas in the U.S., an individual company can be as obnoxious as they want to be in using the frequency, and everyone else has to live with that, unfortunately.
Well, I will say that whether everybody else has to live with that is still an open question. It is, Qualcomm has made it clear that come hell or high water, they want to do it in their particular way, which just happens to coincide with them keeping all of their patent royalties that they would otherwise lose if they had to go through a standard, more traditional standard-setting body and put these things under the patent sharing policies that standard-setting bodies use. Qualcomm has a very clear motive to try to put stuff out there in a particular way, and the FCC has, at least so far, cast a skeptical eye on Qualcomm's efforts and motivation. That said, without some kind of regulatory action, there's only so long that the FCC can keep Qualcomm from deploying the technology that they want to deploy, or deploy something that initially conforms to a more friendly version of LTEU, and then change it as soon as they actually have chips out in the marketplace. It's we're not adopting the European approach yet, because so far the regulations in the that exist now don't require the LTEU to play nice with Wi-Fi and other unlicensed protocols, which is what the European regulators did. But we also, I just want to stress, this is not an issue where Qualcomm can just go ahead and do whatever the hell it wants, and Wi-Fi is doomed if people, whether or not people try to stand up for it.
Well, I think that's what we're going to be doing with Next Century Cities on behalf of our member cities. We'll be doing our best to make sure that we're able to preserve the Wi-Fi that we have, the open spectrum that we have for all of the reasons we've listed, and to expand opportunities for all of these new devices and opportunities and innovation of the future. I'd like to thank Harold, Paul, Ellen. Thank you all for taking time today and informing us on this, and we may be coming back to you with more questions, and we'll be here to help out. Brendan, did you want to wrap it up?
I just wanted to thank everybody again for taking the time to join us for this call, and just to echo Chris's sentiments, especially thanking our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.